Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Dr. Brad Roberts. I'm Director of the Center for Global Security Research, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's session with Dr. George Perkovich, who will be speaking about the topic of where are we going with nuclear weapons. Before introducing George, let me just say a few words to set the context. As everyone knows all too well, over the last 10 to 15 years, we've witnessed an accelerating erosion of the global security environment. The cooperation among the major powers that was possible and to an extent evident in the immediate aftermath of the Cold War has given way to rivalry and even direct confrontation. Regional powers in Northeast Asia, South Asia, and Southwest Asia have made progress in building nuclear deterrent capabilities of their own. The arms control architecture has crumbled away under our feet. U.S. allies are increasingly anxious about the political resolve of the United States to defend them in nuclear crises. Nuclear energy is undergoing something of a renewal, and advanced technologies are proliferating in various ways and promise to change the face of war. Collectively, these factors have effectively put an end to the nuclear order that was cobbled together painstakingly over decades in the 20th century. So what do? Well, it's tempting to say we just walk away. We walk away from the project of trying to build and safeguard a nuclear order. But we can't simply say that nuclear order isn't important anymore. After all, the trajectory that we're logically on culminates in an end to the long nuclear peace. And this would be catastrophic for everyone, not just the initial victim of the attack. So if we can't walk away from the table, the nuclear order table, what should we do? In my view, it's time for a return to the most fundamental questions, and it's time to do some fresh thinking about them. What kind of new order is possible? How can it be made durable? What should the U.S. do practically to build that order? What can it do? And what should it ask of others? And what should it expect from them? So this is a pivotal moment and a time for fresh thinking. And our speaker today is at the center of this national discussion, one of the most thoughtful experts on these matters in Washington, D.C. and the United States generally. George joins us from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, where he serves as Vice President for Studies, and where he also holds the Japan Chair for A World Without Nuclear Weapons. His work focuses on nuclear strategy and nonproliferation issues, on cyber conflict, and on new approaches to international public-private management of strategic technologies. He is the author of an award-winning history of India's pursuit of the nuclear bomb. He's a California boy made good, a bachelor's degree at the University of California at Santa Cruz, went on to a master's degree from Harvard University and a PhD from the University of Virginia. I'll turn the floor over to George here in a moment, but just to remind people, George will speak for 30 to 45 minutes, somewhere in that range. Then we'll have a discussion session that will run until we hit the 90-minute mark. If you'd like to join that discussion, please raise your hand electronically, and I'll call on you in the order in which you do so, or send something in the chat, and I'll do my best to get it into discussion before we run out of time. We have an excellent turnout today, so if you want to join the discussion, please don't wait until George is finished. Go ahead and raise your hand so that we're ready to go when that opportunity arises. George, thanks so much for your leadership on these issues. Thanks so much for making the time to share your thinking with us today. Over to you.
Great. Thanks, Brad. And it's great to be here with you in Livermore and have colleagues joining on this event by Zoom. Let me give a little background on the project because I really am looking for advice, critique, comments, and so I'm looking forward to the discussion. Basically, what I'm going to sketch for you all is the kind of the logic or the guts of a monograph that I'm working on with Japanese colleagues that will be published by Carnegie and Nagasaki University. And it's meant to address this predicament that we're in and that Brad alluded to. And it's an especially poignant predicament for people and the government of Japan, because perhaps more than other countries and societies, there is a very, very strong interest in Japan in nuclear disarmament for obvious reasons. And there's also a very strong interest in nuclear deterrence. Again, for increasingly obvious reasons having to do with the DPRK and China. And so there's always kind of a struggle in Japan, as there are in other societies, to kind of reconcile these interests, these desires, these imperatives. And so in this monograph, I'm trying to sort through how one might approach preserving the peace and trying to enhance stability in the current environment, which I'll summarize, but you all know better than I, how you can do that. And at the same time, keep faith with much of the world's desire for, demand for progress towards nuclear disarmament, because much of the world isn't going to be a belligerent in any of the conflicts that would escalate to nuclear use. They're more likely to be totally innocent bystanders and victims to a conflict that could have consequences greater than any other human experience. And so how do you reconcile those positions? And that's what I'm trying to do in this monograph, whose essence I'll share with you now, but I really welcome the feedback. Where I would start is to say that preventing nuclear war and other existential military threats today requires us to focus much more on politics than on the qualities and numbers of weapons. And yet many participants in nuclear policy debates do the opposite. So you have governments, activists, and others who are demanding the abolition of nuclear weapons without addressing the political security conditions that would be necessary for that or that would follow that. And then you have advocates of building more or better nuclear forces who don't fully acknowledge the risks of inadvertent nuclear escalation, nor do they concentrate on making genuine efforts to mutually stabilize relations. So it's a focus on hardware and not on kind of the software of political relations. Meanwhile, the United States needs potential recourse to nuclear weapons to defend itself and allies from possible attacks from Russia, China, and North Korea. None of these states can be forced to give up nuclear weapons. And right now, their leaders feel they would be destroyed politically if they pursued unilateral nuclear disarmament. I would argue there are many underlying causes of the current aversion to nuclear arms control and disarmament. And there are many causes in each state, many impediments to stabilization efforts. The ones that I'm kind of focused on most these days, and I would put out for your consideration, the most important to my mind is a reluctance of adversaries to compromise with each other domestically and internationally. And by that, I mean, any of the stabilization efforts and arms control that we had in the past involved compromise, give and take. Yet if you have a domestic system that doesn't now feature or allow compromise, it's very hard to imagine that then the leaders in that system where there isn't compromise or where compromise is extremely difficult, it's hard to imagine them being willing and feeling politically supported to compromise with an evil adversary, right? So in Washington right now, where I live, uh, it's very hard within one party to get agreement on a budget, let alone to compromise with the other party. Compromise is a bad word. It is a bad thing to do, and we see it in our internal politics, and then we see how that plays out externally. So if someone would make a deal with the Ayatollah, that's unacceptable. Same with our other adversaries. And then we have counterparts where you have personalist dictatorships, autocracies, where the leaders don't brook any opposition. And opponents may fall out of windows or have other things happen to them. And those leaders are surrounded by people who just say yes. And therefore, those leaders are very unused to the idea of having to give and take and compromise. And that's kind of the structure that we have now internationally. So it's hard to think about the give and take required to mutually stabilize relations and pursue something like arms control. That's one big source, I would argue. Another is the fear that one nuclear power will seek to remove or control the regime of others. Obviously, Russia, China, and the DPRK have long worried about U.S. intentions of regime change. The DPRK has as well. This is a problem that at different times Pakistanis have felt, and it is a challenge that has to be addressed directly, I would argue. There's concern that new technologies will be developed or deployed that give hope of winning a war without causing all-out nuclear escalation. All right. And so if there's kind of a technological breakthrough that may give one side a sense that it can get away with something big, then that makes others want to compensate for that or perhaps cling more to early use of nuclear weapons to deter that kind of technological leap forward. There's the role of military industrial complexes, certainly in Russia, I would argue certainly in the United States, and certainly in Pakistan, and we can talk about some of the other nuclear armed states. And then the last factor I would highlight here is worst case policy making that militates against the type of balanced deal making that you would need to pursue with adversaries to stabilize relations. There's always been worst case policy making, but at different times there were at least kind of countermeasures to it or ways to mitigate it. I think that the tendency is becoming a bigger part of the problem going forward. That isn't to argue, like assume the best or to be naive, but some better proportionality, I would argue, is called for. And a current example of that is the idea that's very prevalent that Russia and China are now partners who will collude and cooperate in potential aggression or war with the United States. That certainly can't be ruled out, but I don't think there's an adequate effort to assess whether that's kind of worst case, probable case, what are the variables that would affect that, how is it perceived in Moscow, how is it perceived in Beijing. There tends to be in our discourse just a kind of a worst case assertion or assumption about that. That's just one example. Now, none of these drivers is new, but today's political and civil society leaders must kind of understand and manage these drivers in much more difficult circumstances than their predecessors did. Compared with the bipolar Cold War, the number of variables and political leaderships that now have to be brought into alignment to negotiate durable restraints appears overwhelming. So I've already talked about the US, Russia, and China. Well, those three and their dynamic affects what India and Pakistan do, for example, in terms of nuclear competition. That kind of works mostly through China, but Russia is a factor there too. So to try to get negotiated restraint or reciprocal restraint in India and Pakistan, you'd have to involve China, which means then the US and Russia. Russia wants to, as it has in the past, but more vehemently perhaps now, to bring UK and French nuclear capabilities into any future conversation about balances with Russia. Dealing with North Korea, we used to say, I would say in an exaggerated way, China's the key to getting North Korea. That underestimated how much the North Koreans hate the Chinese and vice versa. But now clearly Russia is a bigger player with North Korea, and actually Chinese leaders are disconcerted about that. But in any case, dealing with the North Korean nuclear challenge requires, the US, South Korea, Japan, Russia, and China somehow to coordinate and cooperate. I could go on, but you get the point. This is much more complicated than what the bipolar Cold War required. From the standpoint of folks who are feeling both urgent about nuclear disarmament or betrayed that the weapon states aren't living up to their commitments under the Non-Proliferation Treaty to pursue nuclear disarmament, they now factor in this overall challenge in a new way, because I think the most avid proponents of building up nuclear capability and overall military supremacy use the threat of nuclear abolition to gain or hold power by branding advocates of restraint or arms control as naifs who are actually favoring unilateral disarmament and will make nations vulnerable to predators. So there's kind of more of these days kind of a missing middle that is in favor of retaining deterrence to some extent, but stabilizing it, restraining it, lowering the risk. And the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, the advocacy of a number of countries and civil society groups for nuclear disarmament enables the allegation to be made, well, that people who want restraint are actually unilateral disarmers, and that's a slippery slope that they're going to put us on. And since that's dangerous, let's don't do anything. And that I would argue has to be countered, or is a challenge to counter going forward. I don't need to remind this group about what's happened with nuclear arms control. There's one treaty left, basically, which is the New START, which expires in February next year. China's undertaking an unprecedented buildup. North Korea continues to diversify and increase its arsenal while blustering more aggressively. And India and Pakistan are competing still. I mean, they've actually managed, I would argue, quite well, but they don't even have dialogue on nuclear stability. All of these governments are engaging in unstabilized nuclear competition, even though it's futile. The other side will counter you. And it's wastefully expensive and excessively dangerous, especially as you get to larger and more destructive arsenals, which I will talk about a little bit more later. Now, each of these competitors, each nuclear armed state, each of the 8 others says that what it's doing is for deterrence. But if the opponents were doing the same thing, each of those states would say the opponent is seeking advantages for offensive purposes. So I think everybody feels it's acting defensively for deterrence, and yet that the other side is seeking an advantage, some kind of either supremacy or revealing some kind of aggressive intent. Now, the problem is most dramatic and dangerous with the US and Russia, and perhaps in the future with China, to the extent that we and they pursue ambitious nuclear counterforce postures against each other's nuclear deterrent and command and control capability. And so in this monograph, there's a chapter that details what I would say are kind of the 8 major liabilities of an unstabilized competition, a competition that's in a sense unregulated, where there aren't negotiated mutual restraints. One of the liabilities is arms racing, and now the U.S. may not be building up and adding numbers, but its competitors are, and so there's a pressure to do that. And in the case of China, its buildup is to counter what has been a longstanding U.S. advantage. And if we don't stabilize that competition, then the pressure in the U.S. will grow to add numbers over time, and so you get arms racing. Second liability is crisis instability and conflict escalation. So the worry is not bolt from the blue attacks, but the escalation of a regional conventional conflict for very good reasons. But if you don't have the strategic balance and issues stabilized with agreements, you don't have the lines of communication that would go with that, and you have basically an unstabilized dynamic, then the risk both of the initial use of force, but its escalation, I would argue, are greater than if you are in a relationship where there has been stabilization and all of the communications and apparatus that go with that. It's wastefully expensive. And the expense is clear, and the U.S. is experiencing this just in trying to update or modernize the arsenal with already the cost overruns and time delays with the replacement ICBM, with the new ballistic missile submarine, with the pit production. You all know these issues. And China has experienced this evidently, which led to the firing of a number of leaders in the last year in the Chinese military. And why I say it's wasteful, if the other side is going to at some point take countermeasures so that whatever advantage you thought you were gaining by building and deploying these new things, the other side is going to counter it, then in the end of the day, it's wasteful, it's futile. The net result doesn't make you that much more secure. Another liability of this kind of unstabilized, unrestrained capability can be overkill, and I'll talk more about that. But you get a destructive capability that, if fully used, would defeat any purpose, would be illegal for what it's worth, or immoral, and cause totally unjustifiable harm to the rest of the world. Another liability of unstabilized competition is there's an absence of positive incentives for the adversary to restrain themselves. You're not putting on offer benefits that both parties or more than two parties could get from restraint, and which itself kind of violates the core principles of deterrence and compellence, which are you make a threat to change their behavior or get them not to act in a certain way, and then they get a reward if they comply. We've left that out in these unstabilized competitions. And then lastly, I would argue, I sometimes I can prove it, but otherwise it would take more research, but that the unstabilized competition and buildup of excessive capability does not correspond with how the actual potential authorizers of nuclear use are likely to approach warfare. And I think that's especially true when it comes to trying, kind of large damage limiting counterforce attacks on the other side's nuclear forces, which drive a lot of planning and a lot of kind of professional work that is the job of defense establishments, military officials in charge of nuclear operations. But historically, I don't think corresponds with how presidents have thought about potentially using nuclear weapons. And I know this is true in India, for example, and I believe it's true in the United Kingdom. I can't speak to others. Now, I would argue to eventually overcome the political forces of unstabilized competition, governments and civil society organizations who advocate nuclear disarmament will need to join with those who value nuclear deterrence, at least temporarily, to build the case for negotiating measures to stabilize deterrence. Deterrence can't be completely destabilized. Deterrence can't be completely stabilized because it's premised on the possibility that one or more competitors might act violently to change the status quo. And then if violence escalates, opponents might respond by using nuclear weapons to defeat them. If there was perfect stability, the nuclear deterrence would no longer be operative, arguably. But we're far short of that. And so measures can be taken, and I would argue should be taken, to make deterrence of conflict more rather than less stable, and to lower the costs and risks that nuclear competition imposes on everyone. Stabilized nuclear competition means the competitors have acknowledged they cannot escape from mutual vulnerability. They explicitly recognize that offensive first strikes and missile defenses can't negate adversaries' capacity to inflict unacceptable damage on them. Politically, at least in states with competitive elections, it will be easier to highlight the danger and expense and futility of unstabilized nuclear deterrence if the alternative is not seen as unilateral nuclear disarmament. I would argue political coalitions can be more readily built if a large number of other governments actively advocate stabilization measures, even though they fall short of nuclear abolition. Now, as I conceive of stabilization here, it involves one large goal and 6 guidelines to reduce nuclear risks, so long as the politics preclude actual progress in nuclear disarmament. The large goal, as I alluded to, is to end nuclear overkill. I would argue that overkill arsenals are those whose size and potential destructiveness are dictated more by bureaucratic interests and processes than by rational considerations of what would deter major aggression by each adversary. In other words, richer understanding of how adversaries are thinking and what they value and what would deter them from beginning a major aggression, if anything would deter them. Second factor in overkill arsenals are those that would cause more death and destruction than the aggression they're supposed to stop. All right. This is something, by the way, that Indian leaders have thus far always appreciated, that when the casus belli, the cause of crises that have occurred since 1998 when they both tested nuclear weapons, have basically been terrorist attacks. And India counter-mobilized, and there was fear of war that then could escalate. But the Indian leadership always had in mind thus far that the initial damage actually wasn't even remotely close to as injurious as a war that could go nuclear would be. And so they kept things in proper proportion. Now, we can talk about the Ukraine war and the degree to which US and NATO leaders have got the proportions right, but this is always an imperative. And overkill arsenals would be those that, if used, would cause so much more damage to everybody than the initial aggression did that it's overkill. And the third criterion or factor in overkill arsenals is that the harm they would do to non-belligerent nations and the overall environment would be unjustifiable morally, politically, and under international law. In other words, overkill arsenals are those that, if fully used, would violate legal principles of discrimination, proportionality, and avoidance of undue suffering. This is especially important to the US, which in the Trump administration, the Obama administration, and others, has insisted that its use of nuclear weapons, if happened, would comply with international law. Other states' position on this is less clear, but politically, in any case, and I would argue in other terms, the potential of an arsenal to cause so much harm to non-belligerents and the global environment is difficult to justify. Now, one of the points here is that nuclear armed states and alliances should engage themselves and the rest of the international community in assessing the likely effects of various nuclear war scenarios. There is a new UN expert group that was agreed in November that is going to do this, that's meant to assess different scenarios for nuclear conflict and what their environmental and human consequences would be. This was done by a vote in the UN General Assembly. The US abstained from a vote. Russia, France, and the United Kingdom were the only states that voted against it. Like I said, the US abstained. China is the only nuclear armed state that voted for the creation of this study group, but that group will start meeting. And the idea is that other countries around the world, when the results of that study are known, will and should press the nuclear armed states to address the implications of that study and to assess how their arsenals and potential operational plans might trigger the worst kinds of consequences or not, and what could be done to change their force postures and their weapons and the number that would lead to a different or less consequential effects on the rest of the world. Now, I suggest that addressing challenges and problems of overkill is important to do and worth doing, but I recognize that in the political environment around the world, taking actual steps to restrain nuclear capabilities, perhaps reduce them and to alter the politics of nuclear debate, that those conditions aren't right. And so to try to create better conditions, better political conditions, I would suggest that civil society, other concerned governments, and the US government, for example, should be asking leaders of the states that we are concerned about as potential aggressors to go back to fundamentals, that we need to be asking fundamental questions before we can get into nuclear weapons specific questions. And to my mind, those fundamental questions would focus on, first of all, will nuclear armed states, will China, will Russia, will North Korea forswear initiating the use of force to take disputed territory or impose changes of government on populations? And that the leaders of these states, including the United States, should be asked to address that question. And if they refuse to address it, to keep being pressed by other heads of state, by multilateral institutions, by media to address it. And then depending on how they address it, to follow up. I've been feeling this is important for quite some time. And then after a press event in Mar-a-Lago yesterday, where the pending leader talked about evidently taking Panama and maybe Greenland and not by force Canada. I think other countries will also be feeling these kind of fundamental questions about ambitions and potential uses of force need to be addressed. Just like I would argue the most pressing question, at least to my mind, is about President Xi's approach to Taiwan and whether there's a deadline in terms of unification and the three principles that had long guided Chinese and US relations and policy, regarding Taiwan, if those have been overtaken by events or change, that issue is most important. And I think the same is true in Pakistan's perspective on India and India's approach to Kashmir. And so that ought to be a priority for those who are concerned about nuclear weapons. And then in the face of unstabilized nuclear competition today that alarms so many people, I think an equally important question is to ask leaders of these governments how they can justify not sustaining high-level dialogues on stabilizing strategic relations with each other. As I said, India and Pakistan have no sustained dialogue on strategic relations. The US and China have no sustained strategic dialogue. There are some summits, they've been productive, but they're not structured and they haven't been sustained. And obviously, we're not talking to the Russian leadership, President Putin, because of the Ukraine war. But it's a reasonable thing for the rest of the world, given how fraught people find the environment and the growing sense of foreboding about nuclear weapons that Brad talked about in his introduction. The idea that the authorizers, the potential authorizers of war and nuclear use, aren't engaged in with each other that we know of on addressing these issues, it seems to me that ought to be unacceptable, and that should be a greater focus of attention in international politics than, for example, abolishing nuclear weapons or focusing on an arms control treaty at this point. I would think that leaders who refuse to answer these questions should be asked them over and over again. Now, if there is traction and we started to get some engagement on mutual restraint or stabilizing relations, then I would say there are 6 guidelines that I would propose and welcome for discussion, guidelines for making nuclear forces and policies more stabilizing and accountable to the rest of the world. First would be to base nuclear policy making on mutual vulnerability, recognizing that quests for nuclear supremacy or substantial damage limitation will stimulate countermeasures that ultimately leave everyone worse off than they would be if they stabilized policies and postures. 2 would be to eschew plans and capabilities to preemptively destroy adversaries' nuclear forces and command and control systems if such counterforce targeting will stimulate destabilizing countermeasures such as additional arms buildups and launch on warning plans. And I welcome in discussion a shift away from counterforce damage limiting, in my view, need not lead to an increased targeting of population centers, which is often alleged. And we can talk about it in the discussion, but I think you could remove, for example, silo-based ICBMs from the target list, and you don't need to add other targets. The list is arguably long enough of targets to be sufficient to deter. And the idea that if somehow you weren't targeting their silos, that they would then become undeterred doesn't, I would argue, fit with how Russian and Chinese leaders think about these things. The third principle would be to limit homeland missile defenses against adversaries' second strike nuclear deterrence to the degree necessary to avoid counter-arms racing and preemptive attacks on missile defense, warning, and command and control capabilities. So it's offering exchanges of limitation on homeland missile defenses in return for limitations and capping a buildup of offensive capabilities. The fourth principle will be to plan to use nuclear weapons only on targets that cannot be destroyed by other means in the time available. There's an understanding that there may be targets in certain conflicts that are escalating, especially while defending U.S. allies, where you have targets that could be destroyed by conventional means, but not quickly enough to accomplish the defensive purpose that's necessary. The fifth would be to reduce risks of inadvertent escalation, especially by understanding how the deployment and use of missiles that are known to carry nuclear as well as conventional warheads could make the targeted country believe it's under nuclear attack and respond accordingly. So it's to disentangle nuclear and conventional forces as much as possible. There are limitations on that, but that would be a principle to guide stabilizing of nuclear competition. And then the last is to recognize that adversaries need more political confidence in each other's intentions to carry out restraints or stabilization measures, and that much more effort needs to be put into how to provide that reassurance, especially at a time when the U.S. is politically unwilling to make legally binding commitments. And so more effort has to go into that. Now, admittedly, there's little political hope for any of this today, but I would say that I'm old enough to remember that similar despair was apparent in the early 1980s after the demise of Détente. And there was a massive buildup. There were deployments of new systems in Europe, primarily bipolar. And at that time, civil society organizations in Europe and the US joined to challenge the renewed arms race, initially with little success. But a few years later, leadership changed in Moscow. Heads of state confidentially sought to reassure each other. And within a decade, whole categories of nuclear weapons were eliminated or removed from deployment, and strategic forces were significantly reduced. Now, it's true, those were simpler times, and there were fewer actors. It was bipolar. And 35 years later, much of what was done then has been undone. But I would argue and hope, obviously, that it's possible that societies and some leaders will recognize the unnecessary danger of current trends and begin laying the groundwork for mutual restraints to be built when political changes allow more reasonable policies. And here I would take some hope from the fact that American presidents in particular can be surprising. Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan were staunch anti-communist defense hawks, yet they are the ones who concluded far-reaching nuclear arms control agreements. And they did that by and large through secret communications with their counterpart. So that was one of the ways in which they dealt with the political environment and political difficulties, was to communicate secretly or confidentially if secrecy is too provocative. And I would argue that that's what would be required and ought to be pursued between the U.S. leadership and President Xi. It's arguably going to be necessary with President Putin, however the war in Ukraine evolves or ends, that controversy will indicate the value of confidential communications to see if progress could be created before it's done overtly. This is true with India and Pakistan. But we all ought to be encouraging the leaderships to try to pursue that kind of exploration of the possibilities of stabilization and restraint that I've alluded to here. The more directly, discreetly, and repeatedly that leaders talk with each other, the more likely some clarity will emerge, either to assuage worst case assumptions or to validate them and prepare defensive actions. I would argue it's impossible to accurately understand competitors from vastly different cultures and systems of government, but it should be possible through dialogue to assess whether their intentions are tolerable enough to pursue mutual restraint in the development and deployment of nuclear weapons. The point is to test whether this view also applies to Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin, and Kim Jong-un, as it should be for the leadership of the United States. So I come back to the political imperative of engaging with counterparts as the starting point. Let me stop there and open a discussion. Thank you.